Okay, in this short video, I'm going to go over the second part of the exam, which are the main ideas. The biggest thing you have to start with is understanding that judges are a part of a system. They're part of an organization, so they behave based on their time in that system. This is going to require you to stop looking at the motivations or the intentions of individual actors and start to see them as part of a social group with their own social norms, their own expectations, their own rules, and their own habits. So we have to start from the reading the behavioral theory of organizations with the understanding that unlike what you were probably taught in your history class or a ancient philosophy class, people used to believe that humans were rational animals, that they were rational actors, that they worked in their self-interest. Beginning in the 1950s through today, there are thousands of studies, scientific studies, that disprove this theory. Humans rarely act out of selfish interest. That doesn't mean that people are not selfish. They can say all sorts of things about their behavior, and that can come across to you as if they're selfish people. The larger finding is that our brains aren't equipped to make those kind of decisions. So you can try to be selfish, but you'll end up accidentally helping other people, or you'll end up following the same patterns that your parents followed, or that you'll start to behave like your friends. So this idea of an independent individual I is a myth. It's a myth of history. And so I'm not rational, you're not rational, no one is rational. The closest thing that we have to rationality are the algorithms that dominate our computers and our social media networks. And those complicated pieces of algebra are as close to rationality as we know of. You and I are nowhere near capable of doing that. And so if you look at these kind of just four examples, people don't understand things that have huge influences over our lives. And so we have to understand that is the situation that we're all equally a part of. The second part is that our memories, both short-term and long-term, regardless of whether you smoke marijuana, are shaped by routines, norms, and rules around us. In other words, they're not very good. Obviously, there's ways of improving your short-term memory, and that is where many drugs dumb down your senses, is in short-term memory. But short-term memory is not terribly useful, except for on things like college exams, or trying to remember somebody's phone number, which in this society, now ruled by algorithms, short-term memory has been largely replaced by computers. So long-term memory is the one that is more important. And I'll give you an example here is on TV, there's always an eyewitness in the crime shows. In real life, there's rarely an eyewitness, not because people don't witness crimes, but because people all report seeing different things about the crime they thought they saw. And so those testimonies are unreliable. They're very rarely used in court. There's famous cases of people being exonerated from wrongful conviction because of faulty eyewitness. This happens constantly. When we were in class back in person, I would demonstrate this by asking people to describe the bus driver of the bus most of us took on the B1 or the B49. And people would remember very broad generalizations, like either it was a man or a woman from their point of view. Maybe they were wearing blue. They might remember the behavior, right? How they thought the person was behaving. Were they a nice person? Were they loud? Were they funny, right? But when you start asking them for details, they had a very difficult time, and most often they got the gender wrong. And they would often get many of the details wrong. In other words, people would disagree. They'd say, well, I was on that same bus and I saw something totally different. This is because our long-term memories really only store things that are familiar to us. And so things that are different are hard for us to accept. They're hard for us to remember. That's why studying is, repeating things, right? Looking at things over and over and over again until it becomes familiar to you, because it's totally different than what you're looking at. And that's because we're shaped by the things around us, by the routines, the norms, the rules, and we start to believe that that's how all of life works. So sometimes when people talk about objective reality, they're not talking about subatomic physics. They're talking about behaviors they think are universal. They think that everybody follows because that's what they largely see in their neighborhood or at their religious community, and they start to believe that's how everybody operates. You experience, traveling, or you go into different neighborhoods, and you'll start to find out that that's not even remotely close to being true. And judges are no exception. They operate mostly with other judges. The other human beings they come into contact are lawyers. They rarely, are participating in, well, they're not allowed to participate in political events, so they're kind of out of that sector. These are people who went to, like myself, we enjoy reading in libraries. So if you're not in a library, we might not know you exist. So getting out and about, right, is not something that's common among judges. I'm not saying they're, socially isolated hermits, but they aren't the most outgoing people. They're not people that run around trying to meet new people. They're not salespeople, right? They're not involved in a lot of exchanges and transactions. And so that influences their behavior and how they see the world. And so one form of conflict, as you would probably guess, right, comes from just different groups of people having different expectations about how people are supposed to behave. And they largely want everyone to follow their rules, but that's true of all groups. And so there is no universal set of rules. There's these kind of small set group rules. Now, we also have pretty severe limits to what our brains are able to do and how it operates. And so we lose sight of goals very quickly, and we start to identify with the methods of the goal. So we start thinking our way is the right way, or our way is the way that will reach the goal. We forget that, there are many ways to scale a pyramid. You can go up a pyramid or a triangle many different ways. There's not one way. But once we get on the path, we think that our way must be the way. And that's because our brain, that's what it can handle. It can handle that, the brain is on one path. It's not on another brain's path. And so it sets out this narrative, this story about the direction we think we're going. Attention is limited and specific. Lots of people claim they have ADD or ADHD. Perhaps you were diagnosed with that by a doctor, but this is also part of your brain. I mean, this is part of everyone's brain. Our brains are not good at paying attention to lots of different things. Football players and airplane pilots have something called situational awareness. Same thing with basketball players. Probably boxers, people who have to pay attention to multiple things at the same time. They develop that skill over time. And they still, when they lose or when they make a mistake, it's because that skill wasn't able to be pulled up at that time. And so this is, again, blame your brain. We tend to blame principals for the acts of their agents. In other words, we tend to blame the president for things that an agency did. We tend to blame a judge for things that a lawyer did. We tend to blame, mom for things that sister did, right? And so this is a way our brain conceives of power, how it conceives of hierarchy. Well, you should have been in charge. That's kind of how we think about it. And in law, we have this principle called negligence, which basically brings this into practice. We assume that the most powerful person should have been in charge. And then there's ways of trying to disprove and prove that other people. But this is a bad habit we have that our brain does. It looks for blame among the most powerful actor in the situation. We don't like thinking about uncertainty, but uncertainty is certain. So I'll say that again. Uncertainty is certain. We just don't like thinking about that. And so uncertainty is dominant, right? It's the thing that we should be thinking about all the time. But if we did that, we'd overload, right? There'd be too many things that we'd have to try to calculate. And again, that's what algorithms largely do, is they calculate uncertain principles and put them into probabilities. You can learn how to do this in a math class, but you'll never be able to do it all the time in every situation. And so we just prefer not to think about it at all. So that's why we blame people, because we don't want to think about probabilities. We struggle to see policies or problems clearly. So we give simple answers to problems. We give simple definitions to policies or solutions, and we want those to work. Again, this is because we think like, I like that food, I don't like that food. I like that person, I don't like that person. And so our brains want the rest of the world to work that way too. So when you're thinking of something complicated like the legal system, this is not a place for immediate reaction. This is a place for slow, consistent reflection. And this is a big issue when we start thinking about criminal justice reform or court reform, is that people tend to recommend solutions that they already know. They don't seek out to try to learn more about the problem. They don't seek other solutions. They don't enter into dialogue with other people. I mean, if you doubt this, just go into social media. Everybody has a solution. And none of them are right. Because these are the ones they're recommending that they know. If it was that simple, we wouldn't have any problems in society. So the issue is that they're basing everything on the images in their own head, and they're not allowing competing claims to enter into their rational processing. And so solutions aren't going to match the problems because we're not really defining the problems very well. People are kind of saying, well, I know the answer, but they don't even know what the problem is. And so again, this is not, a good place for this to occur, individual decision making in the court system. And yet this is how our brains are wired. So we have to start with this basic understanding. Now, it could be, I don't know, but it could be that there are many white male judges who don't like people of color. It could be, that could be true. But I don't have any way of really evidencing that. And if I were to ask them, I doubt very many of them would just tell me, yes, absolutely, I'm a racist bigot. What's more likely, or what's an easier way of explaining bias, is that judges have benefited from white male privilege. And so they view the world through white male points of view. And so if society or if white male groups have a tendency to be discriminatory or to use stereotypes, judges are also going to do that. They're not separate from those groups. They were born and raised and went to school in those groups. Same thing with police. Police might be jerks. They might be good people. They might be sweethearts. They might be violent people, right? But as a group, they are following certain policies and procedures that have bias built into them. And so a good person can do a bad thing. A jerk can do a good thing, depending on how they're trained and what the social norms are within that individual group. So even the idea of like Blue Lives Matters doesn't really make much sense, because people in blue in Seattle do not behave the same way as people in blue in New York or the people in blue in Houston. And so this is obviously a response, but Black Lives Matters is statistically proven, right? Across, it doesn't matter which jurisdiction you're in, there is systemic racism towards especially black and brown men. And so the response is, lots of people want to blame the entire concept of policing. Well, you could look at the systemic history of policing and have very good things to say about that, but it'd be tied to the United States history of racism. And so police are only behaving the same way most people behave in society. They're only behaving the way that they're often portrayed in the media and in movies and in stories. And so again, this is not because of the individual judges or the individual police officers. This is because the social group behaves that way, or what Trump called locker room talk, right? It's the way that the social group is formed. Now, trial lawyers also have their own group, and that's a different group than police and judges. So sometimes there's this tendency to think that the prosecutors and the police officers and the judges are all working together. Again, it could be possible. I mean, they could go out to dinner and put a big plan to work together. We'd probably have pretty good evidence of that. It'd be easy enough to spy on them. But in general, right, they go to different schools. They go to different groups. They go to different social networks. So they're all kind of biased by their own groups. Those biases can overlap. If society is, prejudiced against people of color and women, then these people are also going to be prejudiced against people of color and women in their behaviors. So we want to define our problems by judicial processes, not by the individual motives of a judge. We want to say something like bail is a problem, and here is why bail is a problem. We don't want to say something like, well, this judge denied bail for this reason, because we don't know the answer to that. We didn't do a psychological profile. We didn't interview the person. We didn't study their life history. And so again, we want to avoid falling into that easy description of the problem and solution, and we want to make things more complicated because this is college, where we have time to reflect on these things. We don't have to make immediate knee-jerk reactions. Remember that solutions are drafted by legislators, so judges don't really make decisions of punishment on their own. Those decisions have already been made by congresspeople, state representative, city councils, mayors, on how they want prosecutors and judges to punish people. So we don't want to blame the judges for decisions that have made before them. And then notice who is not included in these problems already. And this is just kind of a social description of criminal justice. So the victims are nowhere involved in this process. At best, they'll be included in something called a victim statement, which you'll see later in the semester. But they're not making the rules, they're not making the punishments, they're not defining the crimes. Police aren't defining the crimes. They're not defining how they think punishment should occur. Judges aren't writing legislation. You know, these are all people who are elected through the political system and campaigning and all those things. And so this is where the two systems don't really match up a lot of the time. What legislators say to their voters they want is often impossible to give in real life. So if we take a simple example, which is very misunderstood, is defund the police. It's probably not a great slogan unless, you want to go into the details of why they chose that slogan. But defund the police never meant to defund the police. It meant take some of the money that is being earmarked to kind of ridiculous things like robots for the police and put that into social programs like healthcare, job assistance, tutoring, right? All the things that try to stop the problem of crime from occurring in the first place, as opposed to giving police officers a bunch of tools to get people after they've committed crimes. And a lot of these tools that just don't work, right? I mean, there's lots of criticism about that robot dog, for example. But notice what people did, right? They heard defund the police and they thought, oh, we're not going to have any police. Now, some people don't want to have any police, and there are social systems in history of which that occurs. In fact, in many racist white societies, in slave times, for example, there were no policing of white people. There was only policing of slaves. And so this idea that there could never be any police or there'll be chaos is just historically inaccurate. But that's not what people are doing, right? They're saying there'd be chaos in the streets, that suddenly everybody would misbehave. Well, there's, of course, a certain amount of truth to that, right? If people who have been discriminated against or people who have been abused for a long time suddenly no longer had that threat, perhaps they would resist. Perhaps there would be an insurrection. But on the other hand, we had police, we have military, and look at what white folks did in Washington, D.C. with police, right? They still caused anarchy. So our solutions cannot be based on this either or. It has to be obviously much more complicated, and we have to look at the legislative processes because this matters. These are the things that are more important. If people don't feel like they're a part of the political process, then they're more likely going to see these problems as larger problems than just police or just judges or just lawyers. So the last idea is to start thinking like a judge. So to stop thinking like what they call an armchair quarterback, right, where you're criticizing everything in a football game, or just a viewer, a consumer of a TV program. Now you have to try to put yourself in the mindset of a judge with all these difficult, contradictory things going on. So you want to reread the Anderson and the Lawrence case before the midterm to focus on the procedures and the rules. Don't focus on the quote-unquote facts. It's not a story that's on TV. You're not looking for the bad guy and the good guy and who's going to solve the case. That you should be taking a fiction class if that's what you're interested in when you think about criminal justice. Criminal justice and judging, the American legal system, is about processes, procedures, and rules. And so you want to go back and see, what is the judge saying about these processes, these procedures, and rules? What does the judge in their mind think that they have to do according to the judicial rules? You have to think about these instead of your own personal political preferences. It's okay to have an opinion, a political opinion, but not if you're a judge. So judges can't use their political opinions. They can't say, well, I don't agree with gay marriage, so therefore I'm going to rule against it. That's not what judges do. That's what you would do in a bad philosophy class. But in a legal class, we're looking, what are the procedures and rules to make the decision about whether the act was legal, whether it was constitutional, whether it was part of this legal process, not the political process. It's not about what is right or moral. Things can be immoral but still be legal. Things can be immoral but still be legal. And things can be wrong. People can be wrong and still be legal. On the flip side, things that are right or moral, civil disobedience, for example, standing up for people, that could be illegal. And so you can't think about this as morality and right and wrong. You could think about it in your personal life, but that's not what judges do. They don't say, well, these are my religious values, so here's what I think the right answer should be. That's not what judges do. Keep in mind, a warrant must be signed by a judge. So a warrant is only valid under the Fourth Amendment if it is signed by a judge. And the only way a judge will sign a warrant is if the police officer, in writing, in detail, shows evidence, okay, not ideas, not opinions, not beliefs, but evidence, actually collected evidence of probable cause, not reasonable suspicion. Try not to get those two confused. Reasonable suspicion is only for street encounters. It's only for warrantless experiences, not for a warrant. You can't get a warrant for reasonable suspicion. You must show evidence of probable, hear that word, probabilities. So this is not, we don't like this. Our brains don't like to do this. And so this is why it has to be detailed, written down, and through evidence and chain of evidence, right? There has to be there's so many requirements to showing probable cause. Whereas reasonable suspicion is the feeling the police officer has in the street if somebody might have a gun, for example, right? They don't have to show probable cause to arrest that person. So that's the difference, right? Arresting people is reasonable suspicion. Probable cause is what you need to get into a courtroom to present evidence. So reasonable suspicion is not evidence in a courtroom. A remand means that the court, the judge, is saying the case has to go back to the lower court because they didn't follow the procedure correctly. They did something wrong. It's usually about evidence. The judge usually admitted evidence they weren't supposed to admit. And sometimes judges will say, I'm not sure what to do in this case. Judge Downing says that in the Anderson case. He'd much rather just send the case to the next court and let them solve this problem because it's just so complicated. And there had been no real good judicial decisions up to that point. Now, a judicial error is not like a grammatical mistake, right? It means that the judge made a mistake of law. So the first error, right, the remand, is about a procedural issue. This kind of error means that they missed a legal case, right? They should have been talking about a legal case, but for some reason the lawyers didn't include it, and so the judge just forgot it existed. Or they misunderstood a legal case, or they explained it in a way that other judges had not explained it. And so just to wrap up, this kind of shows you, right, thinking like a judge is you have to start thinking you're surrounded by other judges, that you're going to be reviewed by other judges, and that there are very particular processes and rules that you have to follow. Your opinions are obviously still there in your brain because you still have a brain, you're still a human, but you have to try to train yourself as a judge to start thinking as this kind of box over here on the right. You know, you've been trained by your education. You've been experienced in your profession as a judge. And then you've gone through the appeals process and you know what you have to do in order to try to make sure you're not going to get overruled as a judge. And then there's these big concepts that you're always thinking about as a judge. Liberty, posterity, which is protection of future generations, equal application of the laws, the separation of powers, defend individuals, and support legislators, right? These are all the principles that a judge is trying to weigh within this context of their education, their professional experience in the appellate process. That's really what influences judges' decisions, much more than, just how you and I might, feel when we go to the grocery store or we go out in public, right? We're not really being judged by people around us to the same extent. And so this is really the main point of the major ideas.